teaching about the Bill of Rights with resources from the National Archives and the Center for Legislative Archives. Okay, that's what we're going to talk about for the next 30 minutes. So, as Denver said, I'm a teacher. And so when I approach these workshops, I'm always thinking about them the way I did when I attended them as a teacher. In the back of my mind, there was always a hope that, well, I guess actually a demand that there better be something in this that I can use in my classroom. I don't want to waste my time on this. I want to get something I can use. So I hope that at the end of this 30 minutes, you say, oh yeah, I can use some of that stuff. So let's get into it and see what I have. As Denver mentioned to you, the National Archives preserves the records that document America's civic legacy of government under the Constitution. And so, we're like the nation's attic in a way, but the stuff that's in that attic is really important because the legacy of self-government under the Constitution is a real singular human achievement. For over 2 centuries, the United States has been governed by the people working through the Constitution. And it's like an inherited culture. It is sustained because each generation teaches the next generation the values, the institutions, the processes that keep this experiment in government alive. And so if you want to know what has happened in the past, as a guide to what we should do in the future, the National Archives is the repository that preserves that story. In our 43 institutions across the country, we have about 14 billion records and miles of audio tape and film and other documents and sources of information, really, that tell the story of America. And so rather than just leave it in the dark, why don't you bring it into your classroom by going to our website, www.archives.gov, and you'll find lots of primary sources you can bring into the class and lots of teacher resources, such as PDF document analysis sheets that you can use to coach your kids on how to work with primary sources. I work for the Center for Legislative Archives. As Denver mentioned, we have the resources that are the records of the House and the Senate. And so to bring those in your classroom, you could go to archives.gov/legislative. And what you'll find is that we have 40 lesson plans on various topics on civics and history. We have a digital app that I'm going to talk to you about, specifically about the Bill of Rights. And we have 5 ebooks. And so go in there and shop around. See if you can find a lesson that you can use in your class. Now, there are 3 takeaways from my presentation this evening. The first is that concerns about the powers of government were expressed in the Declaration of Independence and also in the debate about whether the Constitution should include a Bill of Rights. My second takeaway, the process of creating a Bill of Rights demonstrates the dynamic interaction of state and federal levels of government. What I mean is that the call for a Bill of Rights emerged from the states, and Congress responded with proposed amendments that the states then ratified. So there's a back and forth between the state and the federal levels of government. Third, studying a primary source that illustrates how Congress created a proposed Bill of Rights provides students with an opportunity for hands-on, active learning about the history of how the states and Congress used constitutional processes to address a serious national debate. The Article 5 process for amending the Constitution, and the process of studying history from primary sources. And of course, what I didn't put on the list, because it kind of goes without saying, is that immersing your kids into the history of creating this Charter of Liberty also teaches them a lot about self-government and about citizenship and about their role in shaping the future. If you'd like to bring the materials I'm going to share with you into your classroom, you can do so by using a free digital app and 2 lesson plans that we'll discuss later this evening. So the digital app is called Congress Creates the Bill of Rights, and we created it to explain the process of how Congress created this charter. Too often the Bill of Rights has been left to the lawyers. It's been talked about and taught to the students through a series of court cases. We felt that it's really much more interesting to see it as proof of how representative government works, about how Congress could address a serious national debate and use Article 5 of the Constitution to amend the Constitution. So in addition to the app, we have some lesson plans. Two I want to share with you are Congress creates the Bill of Rights, completing the Constitution. In that lesson, the students will chart the course of change over time and look at the overall picture of how different topics came into the discussion about rights. And not all of them stayed in the whole way. Some of them were winnowed out by the Senate as they were, refining the proposed amendments. So the kids can get a visual picture of that debate. And I'll show you how they do it. A brand new lesson that we just put up this week looks at it from a different point of view. That takes you inside the debate and does close textual analysis by looking at versions of 4 different proposed amendments. They contrast the state ratifying conventions of what they said with what James Madison proposed in the House with what Congress ultimately passed. All right, so here's our app, Congress Creates the Bill of Rights. I'm going to give you a very brief overview of what it has. Basically, here's the menu. So you can see that it's divided into 3 big sections. First thing, you get the context by getting the chronology and by getting a slideshow that tells you about what America was like at the time when this debate emerged. Okay, in the middle column, you go inside the first Congress. Now, to understand this process of Congress creating a Bill of Rights, what you have to know are who were the people, what were the issues, and what did they do? And so when we built this, we have a section that gives you little bios of the leaders of the House debate. We have a section that lays out the issues and talks about, what the Federalists wanted, what the Anti-Federalists wanted. And then we take you into a document we're going to study more closely in a minute, the Senate Markup, to see what the Senate did in this process. And then we take a really close kind of microscopic look at various proposed amendments, and you'll see them at various stages in the process. And then the third section of the app is a series of discussion questions. So this is a deep dive into the process of how Congress created the Bill of Rights. Now, the TEKS want you to know a number of things about this process. So they want you to know that the student understands the American beliefs and principles reflected in the Declaration of Independence, the US Constitution, and other important historic documents. They want the students to identify colonial grievances listed in the Declaration of Independence and explain how those grievances were addressed in the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Third, they want the students to understand the purpose of changing the US Constitution and the impact of amendments on American society. And they have to summarize the purposes for changing the Constitution. I have no guidance on that purposes part of that. That sounds a little sweeping to me. The next one, the student understands the dynamic nature of the powers of the national government and state governments in a federal system. And as I've mentioned already, this story about creating a Bill of Rights is a good illustration of that back and forth between the states and the federal. And so the student is expected to analyze the arguments of the Federalist and Anti-Federalist. And finally, summarize the rights guaranteed in the Bill of Rights. Okay, so those are the things I directly addressed as I made this PowerPoint. But the first challenge, and I'm just going to kind of talk you through this, although we could actually spend quite a lot of time on it, because it gets at the question of, yeah, okay, we want to talk about rights. But a lot of you teach like 7th graders, and the problem is that the concept of a right is a very abstract concept. And so a lot of your kids just won't understand what it is. You can't, I mean, they know kind of what a right is in general terms, but if you ask them to really pin it down, it's very hard to define. So how do you take an abstract concept and help the kids make it concrete? So we made this Venn diagram activity, and in it, the students are going to define a right by talking about them within the context of your classroom, because that's a community of learners in which they operate every day. So if you think about a right in the sense of it's like a bubble of protection around an individual into which they have kind of autonomy and people can't intrude. If you think about a student's rights in your classroom, a student has a right to safety. A student has a right to learn. A student has a right to be treated with respect. And if you think about a teacher's rights, a teacher has a right to run the environment, the learning environment. The teacher has the right to set the pace for instruction. And if you think about the limits that teachers are under, well, they have to teach what's on the curriculum. They have to treat the students with respect. They have to make sure that the students are in a safe learning environment. And if you think about the students' limits, well, I have a right to learn, but I can't get in the way of other people's learning. and I can't endanger the safety of other students. And I really have to follow along with the curriculum. I can't just go my own way. And so if you think about it, by having the students delineate their rights and the teacher's rights, their limits and the teacher's limits, what they can do is creating examples. They can begin to build a definition of this abstract concept of a right. And so that it's not just talk, it becomes something real. And so we have found that teachers got a lot of mileage out of this Venn diagram. So I suggest it to you as something you can use as you're teaching your kids about the Bill of Rights. Let's dig into what the TEKS want you to cover. They want you to identify colonial grievances listed in the Declaration of Independence and explain how these grievances were addressed in the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Well, I picked 6 examples. You could probably find more, but if you look at the grievances that are listed in the Declaration of Independence, he has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. Okay, if you think about that, that's going to be a factor in the discussion about a Bill of Rights. It's going to be included in the proposals that come from state ratifying conventions. And to an extent, it's going to be, after all the congressional negotiating, still present in the Bill of Rights. Because if you look at what's the point, if you look at number 1, what they're saying is that the people have a right to be governed by representatives, and we're going to see that in the Bill of Rights. Secondly, the people have a right to express dissent. He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise. We have the notion here that power originates with the people, the concept of popular sovereignty, that rights belong to the people. And we're going to talk about how that becomes part of the Bill of Rights. Thirdly, he has kept among us in times of peace standing armies. And there are going to be questions in the Bill of Rights about the role of a standing army in peacetime. And he has quartered large bodies of armed troops among us. We'll have a specific element of the Bill of Rights, an article that says no quartering of troops in homes. And so the last 2 you can see relate to the trial by jury, and you'll see that the right to a trial by jury and the right to know the crime charged and the right to have charges brought by a local grand jury are going to be parts of the debate about the Bill of Rights and ultimately appear in the Bill of Rights. So the question of teaching how grievances from the Declaration of Independence appear in the Bill of Rights is pretty straightforward, but the more important thing is showing the kids how they work through that debate and appear in the final product. Well, the next TEK recommendation is that the student should understand the dynamic nature of powers of the national government and the state governments in a federal system. And the way you can get at this is just by thinking about the chronology, the debate timeline. In September of 1787, the Constitutional Convention voted that the Constitution did not need a Bill of Rights. Now it's going to go to the states, and the states are going to debate whether to ratify that Constitution or not. And anti-federalists in several state ratifying conventions will argue that a Bill of Rights is essential to the Constitution, and they will begin to formulate about 200 proposed amendments that should be added to it. Okay, now the scene shifts. Congress meets in April of 1789, and from April to October, this debate is on the federal level. Congress debates moderate amendments that can be incorporated in a Bill of Rights to satisfy criticisms from the states. And then the dynamic shifts again, because from October of 1789 to December of 1791, it shifts back to the states. And there the debate happens in the state legislatures, where they debate whether to ratify a Bill of Rights as much a part of the Constitution as anything else. So that chronology begs the question of, okay, what contributions did anti-federalists in state ratifying conventions make to what became the Bill of Rights? And you're going to see that they had an absolutely essential role in shaping the Bill of Rights. There are 4 big concepts in the Bill of Rights as debated in Congress that come from the anti-federalists. Not all the anti-federalist ideas, recommendations, demands made it, but these 4 did. And you'll see when we look at the Senate markup how prominent they are. First, there are amendments that establish limits on governmental authority. Second, there'll be amendments that protect legal rights. Third, there'll be amendments regulating powers within the government and between the federal and state governments. And fourth, there'll be an amendment about the source of rights. So if you want to know in detail how that happens, about how the state ratifying convention proposals go to Congress and how they're shaped within Congress, if you go to our app, this section down here, amendments and process, will walk you through the 16 amendments that are relevant to that conversation. But we frankly don't have time to detail them this evening. What we can talk about is what's the process. By what process did Congress take the proposed amendments from the state ratifying conventions and negotiate them into what we call the Bill of Rights? And again, there's a timeline which we're just going to touch upon, but you can see that from May to August of 1789, the action is in the House of Representatives, where James Madison proposes amendments which are debated, refined, shaped, and ultimately 17 of them are passed, and they send them on to the Senate. So that's in August of 1789. And then in September of 1789, there's a 2-week Senate debate where they modify what the House sent over. And in some cases, they accepted it, but in other cases, they deleted it altogether. And in a third instance, they changed the wording. So in order to reconcile that, they send them back to the House. And then for a few that the House didn't agree to, they had a conference committee. And so the end of September, there's a conference committee that issues a report. And ultimately in October, the states ratify the proposed amendment. So that's the process in Congress. Now, what did they do? Well, this document shows what they did. And this is the document you're going to take away from this workshop, I hope, and use in your classroom, because I think it's about one of the coolest documents we have. It's the Senate markup. And it's the primary source that really shows Congress at work. So let's dig in a little bit. And so, you can see, how do concepts from state ratifying conventions organize the Bill of Rights? Well, if you look at that markup, the first 6 proposed articles assert that government power should be limited. And there are 6 ways, 6 specific government powers that should be limited. And so you look at the first one, Congress must be representative. And that's this is an amendment we're going to zoom in on when we do the breakout groups later on. But the idea that the government must be representative. The second, officials cannot increase their own salaries. They can't make participation in government be a career path where they enrich themselves. Third, Congress may not establish an official religion. And fourth, speech, press, assembly, and petition rights should be protected. Then there are 2 limits on the government's power that are about militia and weapons. And basically they say we don't want a standing army. We want a militia composed of the body of the people to defend the state. And 6th, the government cannot quarter troops in private homes. And so I hope that you will dig into that article, the 5th, with your students. But again, because of the short time we have this evening, I'm not going to look at it in much detail. I'm just going to say that proposed amendments 7 through 10 are very specifically about the legal rights. And so there you see that idea from the anti-federalist saying that we want things guarantees, like the right to be secure from unreasonable searches and seizure, that warrants must be specific, and that there's no double jeopardy, and that we have protection from our property being taken without compensation. We have a protection for the rights to a speedy and public trial, and that charges will be brought by a grand jury, and a right to an impartial jury will be in place for any trial in a criminal case. So you can see that these legal rights are limits on government, because the government has to preserve individuals from abuses of the legal system. For example, the decision of local juries must be respected. In a big country, you could be tried in one state and then retried in the national capital, maybe hundreds of miles away, if you didn't have protection against that sort of an abuse. And so you can see the anti-federalists very specifically wanted to have an amendment to say that, the facts found by a jury cannot be retried anywhere else. This amendment about the right to a jury trial in a civil case balances the right to a jury trial in a criminal case, and then no excessive bails or fines and no cruel and unusual punishment. Now, in this treatment of amendments, the 14th one is actually a Federalist idea. And this amendment was not proposed by a state ratifying convention. And it's an interesting anomaly to ask your kids to look at. James Madison introduced it. He said it was the most important idea, and he introduced it to give the federal government veto power over the actions of the states. And so you'll see the first 2 words on it: no state No state shall infringe the right of trial by jury in criminal cases, nor the rights of conscience, nor the freedom of speech or of the press. And so you can see here that this is a federalist idea, because it would be the federal government reining in the states. And so, it gives you more of the sense that this is a debate. This is a back and forth between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists trying to shape this charter. But these, you'll see, are very much anti-Federalist, because this 15th article says, this becomes Amendment 9, by the way, says the people invested some of their natural rights in the government, but they've retained the rest, right? The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. And the 16th one is about the balances between the branches of the government in this new Constitution. So the Anti-Federalists wanted to keep everything in place, keep everything the way the Constitution was originally set up in terms of the balance of power. They didn't want the executive branch to get big, or Congress to dominate, or the courts to dominate. So basically they say that the powers delegated shall be exercised as therein appropriated, so that the legislature shall never exercise powers vested in the executive, and so on. That never word is really restrictive. And so 17 is our 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated to the federal government nor prohibited to the states are reserved to the states. But when you're looking at these, what you can see is the negotiating process. You can see that Article the 16th was dropped, Article the 14th was dropped, and you can talk about why those ideas perhaps were dropped. But Article 17, you can see negotiating in a different way, because it says the powers not delegated by the U.S., not delegated to the U.S. by the Constitution, nor prohibited by the states, are reserved to the states respectively. Okay, the Anti-Federalists wanted that to say the powers not expressly delegated, but you can see a winnowing down where it's the powers not delegated. It's not quite as strict a division. And then you get to the other end of it, even without the word expressly, is still a division between the federal and the states. But what about when you add "or to the people" at the end? Is that a poison pill that makes that whole proposed article so vague that it doesn't mean anything? Well, I don't know the answer to that, but it's the kind of thing you can teach your kids to be critical thinkers by talking about. Now, how does the Senate markup of the Bill of Rights reflect negotiation? I'm going to show you something that's in the app, and there's only a couple of points I want to make about it, because I want to save a lot of time for your questions and our conversation. But what I'm going to show you, you can look at in more detail, and you can show your students. If you go into Congress Creates the Bill of Rights, the app I've been talking about, you can see a step-by-step analysis of how Congress shaped the First Amendment if you go to the close-up on compromise section, okay? And while I'm doing my infomercial about this app, let me just say, we created it for the Apple iPad, and so you can download it, and use it on an iPad. But a lot of teachers don't have iPads. And so we made a PDF version. And so for most of you who have Chromebooks and other devices, the PDF version has the same content as the app. It just doesn't bounce around the same way. It's linear, so you have to scroll. But all this stuff is in there. So you can go in and see it step by step. So this is a zoom in. If you looked at the facsimile of the Senate markup of the Bill of Rights, this is Article the 3rd and Article the 4th, which will be combined to become what we call the First Amendment. Well, look how heavily marked up they are. Clearly, there was a lot of debate about that. And so if you go into that debate and look at it day by day, you can really learn some interesting things about the process of negotiation that shaped the Bill of Rights. So let's do that. On August 24th, 1789, these two articles came from the House over to the Senate, and the third one said, Congress shall make no law establishing religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, nor shall the rights of conscience be infringed. And Article 4 said that the freedom of speech and of the press and of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and consult for their common good and to apply to the government for the redress of grievances shall not be infringed. Okay, you recognize those as two parts of what we call the First Amendment, and obviously they were combined. But the process by how they were combined raises some really interesting questions to get into with the kids. So what we do in the app is we take it day by day and we show it to you change by change. We made a little track changes thing. So you can see the changes in a facsimile up here. You can see them, like a track changes document on your computer down there. And then at the bottom of the screen, there's a pane where it explains what's going on. Well, I want to look at a couple of things in this. I don't want to look at every bit of it, but I want to look at right what you see on the screen now, because you can see that they changed the language on religion. So Congress shall make no law establishing religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That was the original language. And you can see in blue, they changed that to establishing one religious sect or society in preference to others. And again, in terms of teaching critical thinking, you can get the kids to talk with you about how the blue is different from what's crossed out in the red, and you could just get them to really wrestle with, well, in the blue version, you could have an official state-supported religion. You just couldn't have one that's in preference to others. And so that's kind of an interesting discussion. More interesting to me is this last phrase right here, nor shall the rights of conscience be infringed. So I don't know what that means. But again, that's a great opportunity to get your kids to define it. What do you think it means? It doesn't mean exactly religion, because they had religion prior to that in the same article. So it's something a little bit different. And so by using their critical thinking skills, they could perhaps come to an idea that a right to conscience is something about perhaps an individual perspective and the right to an individual perspective. And it gets really interesting because they crossed it out. And now you got something you can talk about. Because why'd they do that? They should have left it in. And would the Bill of Rights be better for our times in the 21st century if we had something like acknowledging a right to conscience? And so, I think that's kind of cool. The second thing I want to talk about in this negotiating of what we call the First Amendment is Article the Fourth. Look at this with me. The freedom of speech and of the press and the right of the people peaceably to assemble and consult for their common good, and to apply to the government for redress of grievances shall not be infringed. So look at that. Where's the fire in a crowded theater exemption? I don't see any limits on the freedom of speech or the freedom of press or the right of the people. It essentially says they cannot be limited. And I think that's really interesting when you look at what the Congress did when they inserted this phrase. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble. Now you can get your kids to explain how those two statements are different. And what I hope they can see is that one is like a universal statement, and the other is a strict limitation on the power of government. And so I think by making it a limitation on the power of government, they kind of bring that in line with the other things we looked at quickly that are in the proposed Bill of Rights, because they're limits on government power. And so this makes it a limit on government power. But it's kind of interesting to ask how that change affected the Bill of Rights, and what would it be like if that had not been made. And so you can see there's a lot of other changes you can talk about, and you can walk them through the process. And you'll see that by September 14th, the Senate has agreed on a version of an article of amendment that's like our First Amendment, only the language is different. If you see Congress shall make no law establishing articles of faith or a mode of worship, you say to yourself, wait a minute, that's not the First Amendment. So where'd the First Amendment come from? It passed the House with certain language, passed the Senate with different language. The House didn't agree to the Senate's language, so they had a conference committee. And in conference committee, they crossed out that Senate version. And under the leadership of James Madison, they adopted this language. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people to petition the government for redress of grievances. So what the kids can see from this is how Congress created the First Amendment as a subset of how Congress created the Bill of Rights. This was a very fast kind of overview of a lot of material. I hope I've given you some things to think about. I hope I've suggested some things you can use in your classroom. And I'll be happy to answer any questions that I hope you have. But I wanted to share with you the reason that I think it's important to take this approach, to show it as an 18th century debate about rights, is because the parallel with the debate about rights that's happening in our times, because it shows the relevance of constitutional governance. It shows how government by the people provides a tool that you can use to chart a course through difficult times as we're facing today. So anyway, I hope that this gives you some things that you can work with. I'm going to stop sharing.